Picture, if you will, a warm evening in the Eocene epoch, about 50 million years ago. The sun is setting over an ancient shoreline, painting the shallow waters of the Tethys Sea in shades of amber and rose. And there, moving through the shallows, is a creature that seems to exist between two worlds. Four-legged, covered in fur, roughly the size of a large dog or a small wolf. It wades into the water, its dense bones keeping it low, stable, as it searches for fish. This is not a seal. This is not a dog. This is one of the earliest ancestors of the largest animals ever to grace our planet. This is where the story of whales begins. Welcome to Bedtime Biology, where science meets serenity. Each night, we explore the quiet wonders of the natural world, calming your mind and sparking your curiosity. Please, like, subscribe, and comment below with where you're checking in from. Tonight, we're embarking on one of evolution's most spectacular journeys. We're going to trace the path of cetaceans, the group that includes all whales, dolphins, and porpoises, as they transformed from hoofed mammals walking on solid ground into the graceful giants that glide through our oceans today. This transformation took millions of years, but in evolutionary terms, it happened remarkably fast. Within just 10 million years, these animals went from wading in streams to ruling the open ocean, and we know this happened because of something extraordinary. We have the fossils, we have the evidence, preserved in ancient stone, showing us step by step, adaptation by adaptation, exactly how this incredible transition occurred. The story we're about to explore is one of the best documented examples of major evolutionary change that science has ever uncovered. It's a story written in bones buried in the hills of Pakistan, the deserts of Egypt, and the cliffs along ancient seabeds. It's a story of creatures caught between worlds, of bodies slowly reshaped by the demands of a new environment, of innovations so profound they allowed these animals to become some of the most successful mammals ever to exist. Before we journey back in time, let's take a moment to appreciate just how unusual modern whales really are. They are mammals, just like us. They breathe air with lungs, not gills. They are warm-blooded, maintaining a steady internal temperature even in the coldest polar waters. They give birth to live young and nurse them with milk, just as land mammals do. And yet, they live entirely in the water. They have no external hind limbs. Their front limbs have become flippers. They have horizontal tail flukes that move up and down rather than side to side like the tails of fish. Their nostrils have migrated to the top of their heads, forming blowholes. They can dive to extraordinary depths, some species reaching more than 2,000 meters below the surface, holding their breath for over an hour. These adaptations are so extreme, so complete, that for centuries, scientists puzzled over where whales came from. Some suggested they evolved from fish. Others thought they might be related to marine reptiles, like the ancient ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs. Even Charles Darwin himself, writing in the 1800s, could only speculate. He knew whales must have had land-dwelling ancestors because of their mammalian characteristics, but the fossil evidence simply wasn't there yet. The breakthrough began in the 1970s and 1980s, when paleontologists started making remarkable discoveries in Pakistan, a region that 50 million years ago sat on the shores of the ancient Tethys Sea. What they found there would transform our understanding entirely. They discovered not one transitional fossil, but many, a whole series of intermediate forms, each one showing a different stage in the transition from land to sea. These weren't vague, fragmentary hints. These were complete or nearly complete skeletons that told a clear, detailed story. And that story begins with a creature that paleontologist Phil Gingerich would name Pakicetus, meaning whale from Pakistan. It was the year 1981 when the first fossils were unveiled to the scientific world, and they were stunning in their implications. Here was an animal with the skull shape of a whale, with certain distinctive ear bones found only in cetaceans, but with the body of a land mammal. It walked on four legs. It had a long, flexible neck. It had a robust tail, though not yet the fluked tail of modern whales. Its legs ended in hooves, advertising its ancestry among the ungulates, the hoofed mammals. This was evolution caught in the act, frozen in stone, waiting 50 million years to tell its story. As we settle in for tonight's journey, let the outside world fade away. Let the noise and rush of modern life dissolve. We're traveling back through deep time now, back to a world that no longer exists except in fossil records and scientific imagination. We'll meet creatures with names like Ambulocetus and Rodhocetus and Basilosaurus, animals that straddled the boundary between land and sea, that pioneered new ways of moving, feeding, and surviving. We'll watch as legs shrink and flukes emerge, as ears restructure themselves for underwater hearing, as bodies streamline and fur gives way to blubber. And through it all, we'll see the power of natural selection, the way environments shape bodies over vast stretches of time, the exquisite responsiveness of life to new challenges and new opportunities. So take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, let your mind drift back, way back, to the warm, shallow waters of the Eocene, where the story begins. The world 50 million years ago was a very different place. The continents were not where they are today. India was still an island, moving northward on its slow collision course with Asia. The Atlantic Ocean was narrower. Antarctica was not yet covered in ice. And spanning much of what we now call the Middle East, southern Europe, and southern Asia was a vast, warm, shallow sea called Tethys. Named after a Greek goddess of the sea, the Tethys Sea was a tropical paradise, its waters teeming with life, its shores lined with lush vegetation. It was along these shores that the ancestors of whales made their living. But before we can understand those ancestors, we need to understand where they came from. And this is where the story gets fascinating, because whales, it turns out, are related to some rather unexpected animals. Through careful analysis of both fossil evidence and modern genetic data, scientists have determined that cetaceans belong to a group of mammals called Artiodactyla. These are the even-toed ungulates, mammals whose weight is borne equally on the third and fourth toes of each foot. This group includes deer, pigs, camels, giraffes, and, most surprisingly of all, hippopotamuses. In fact, genetic studies have shown that hippos are the closest living relatives of whales. Not dolphins, not seals, not any other marine mammal. Hippos. Now, this doesn't mean that whales descended from hippos. Both groups descended from a common ancestor that lived over 50 million years ago. That ancestor was terrestrial, walking on land, but likely spent time in and around water. The ancestors of hippos went one way, adapting to rivers and lakes, but remaining fundamentally land animals. The ancestors of whales went another way, moving progressively further into marine environments until they left land behind entirely. What might this common ancestor have looked like. We don't know for certain, but we have clues. It was probably a small to medium-sized mammal, something like a small deer or pig in size. It likely had 4 functional legs with hooves. It probably lived near water and may have waded into streams or coastal shallows to feed on plants or hunt for fish. And crucially, it probably had certain skeletal features, particularly in the ankle bones, that mark it as an artiodactyl. These ankle bones, with their characteristic double pulley shape, would turn out to be one of the most important clues in unlocking whale origins. For decades, there was a competing hypothesis. Some paleontologists thought whales might be related to an extinct group of carnivorous mammals called mesonychids. These were wolf-like animals with hooves instead of claws, and some species lived near water. Superficially, they seemed like plausible whale ancestors. But when genetic data from modern whales became available in the late 20th century, the evidence was clear. Whales are artiodactyls, not mesonychids. And when more complete fossils of early whales were discovered, showing those diagnostic ankle bones, the mystery was solved. But why would a land mammal return to the water? After all, the ancestors of all land vertebrates had crawled out of the water hundreds of millions of years earlier. Why go back? The answer lies in opportunity. The Tethys Sea and its coastal regions offered abundant food resources. The waters were rich with fish, mollusks, and other prey. For a mammal capable of exploiting these resources, there was less competition than on land, where many other predators and herbivores were already established. Water also provided refuge from land-based predators, and for mammals living in hot climates, water offered a way to regulate body temperature. Early whale ancestors probably started by wading into shallow water, perhaps to escape danger, perhaps to hunt, perhaps simply to cool off. Over time, those individuals that were slightly better adapted to moving through water, to finding prey in water, to spending longer periods in water, had advantages. They caught more food, they survived better, they left more offspring. Generation after generation, the population shifted, becoming more aquatic, until eventually the descendants of land mammals became fully marine animals. This is natural selection in action, but it's important to understand just how profound the changes needed to be. Every system in the body had to be modified. Limbs that evolved for walking needed to become efficient for swimming. A coat of fur that worked on land needed to be replaced by insulation that worked underwater. Ears tuned for airborne sound needed to detect underwater vibrations. Nostrils positioned at the end of the snout needed to move to the top of the head for easy breathing at the surface. Tails that simply balanced the body needed to become powerful engines for propulsion. Bones that were light and strong for running needed to become dense for controlling buoyancy. Every organ system, every structure, had to be rethought, reimagined, redesigned by the slow hand of evolutionary change. And the fossil record shows us, step by step, how this happened. It's time to meet the first player in this drama, the one that started it all, the wolf-sized creature with a name that means whale from Pakistan. It's time to meet Pakicetus. In the early Eocene, about 53 to 50 million years ago, a remarkable animal lived along the rivers and coastal regions of what is now Pakistan. The year was 1978, when paleontologist Phil Gingerich and his team were working in the Kuldana Formation, layers of rock that had once been riverbanks and floodplains along the ancient Tethys Sea. They were searching for fossils of early mammals, hoping to better understand the fauna of this critical period in Earth's history. And then, among the reddish sediments, they spotted something, a skull fragment, weathered, partially embedded in the rock, but unmistakably mammalian. As they carefully excavated the specimen, cleaning away millions of years of accumulated sediment, they began to see features that didn't quite fit any known mammal. The skull was long and narrow, reminiscent of a wolf's, with a streamlined shape that suggested an animal comfortable in water. The teeth were thick and powerful, with the kind of robust construction you'd expect in an animal that dealt with challenging prey, perhaps slippery fish or hard-shelled prey items. But more importantly, strikingly, almost shockingly, the structure of the inner ear was utterly unlike any typical land mammal. The bony dome that housed the middle ear bones, called the auditory bulla, was greatly thickened and dense, a feature seen only in one group of mammals: cetaceans, whales. Could this be a whale fossil in river deposits? A whale with a skull that suggested a long-snouted predator. The implications were staggering. If this was truly a whale ancestor, it meant whales had come from land. It meant there was a transitional form, something between terrestrial mammals and the fully aquatic cetaceans of modern seas. It meant one of evolution's greatest mysteries was beginning to unravel. They named it Pakicetus inachus. Pakicetus for Pakistan, where it was found. Inachus after Inachus, a river god from Greek mythology, appropriate for a creature that seemed to have lived in and around fresh water. The name was officially published in 1981, and the scientific world took notice. Here was hard evidence of whale origins, preserved in 50-million-year-old stone, waiting patiently to tell its story. But that first skull was incomplete. Only parts of the cranium, fragments of the jaw, some teeth. It was enough to establish that Pakicetus was something special, but not enough to fully understand the animal. What did its body look like? How did it move? Where exactly did it live? These questions would take years and additional discoveries to answer. Through the 1980s and 90s, more fossils of Pakicetus were found. Not complete skeletons, unfortunately. The fossils were always isolated bones, scattered pieces that had been separated by water currents or scavengers before fossilization. But gradually, by gathering these scattered pieces and carefully comparing them, by understanding which bones could have come from the same species based on size and morphology, paleontologists were able to construct a composite picture. They couldn't point to a single complete Pakicetus skeleton and say, this is what it looked like. But by combining information from many individuals, they could make educated reconstructions. What emerged was a picture of an animal approximately 1 to 2 meters in length, about the size of a large dog or small wolf, perhaps weighing 30 to 50 kilograms. It had 4 fully functional legs that ended in small hooves, marking it unmistakably as an ungulate, a member of the hoofed mammals. The legs were robust and relatively short, not the long gracile legs of a running animal like a deer or antelope, but sturdy limbs built for strength rather than speed. The front legs and back legs were roughly similar in length, unlike some mammals where the hind legs are much longer, suggesting this animal moved with a relatively level back, all 4 feet contributing equally to locomotion. It had a long, flexible neck with 7 cervical vertebrae like all mammals. This neck would have allowed Pakicetus to turn its head with considerable range of motion. useful for an ambush predator that might need to strike quickly at prey from different angles. Its eyes were positioned on the sides of its head, typical for land mammals, giving it a wide field of view useful for detecting predators approaching from various directions. But interestingly, the eyes were placed relatively high on the skull, higher than you'd expect for a purely terrestrial mammal. When Pakicetus lowered its body into water, these high-set eyes would remain above the surface even when much of the head was submerged, allowing the animal to see while mostly hidden beneath the water, perfect for an aquatic hunter. The skull itself was long and narrow, with a pronounced snout. This shape is aerodynamic, or rather hydrodynamic, offering less resistance to water flow than a blunt, broad skull would. The nostrils were positioned at the very tip of the snout, just like in most land mammals, which tells us that Pakicetus had not yet adapted to the breathing while swimming lifestyle of modern whales. It would have needed to lift its entire head out of water to breathe, just as a dog or wolf would. The teeth tell a detailed story. Pakicetus had a full set of different tooth types, what we call heterodont dentition. At the front of the mouth were incisors, relatively small but sharp, useful for grabbing and holding. Behind these were large canines, elongated and pointed like daggers, perfect for piercing flesh. Then came premolars and molars, the cheek teeth, and these were particularly interesting. They were robust, with thick enamel and multiple cusps. Analysis of wear patterns on these teeth showed scrape marks, indicating that Pakicetus ground its teeth together as it chewed, processing food rather than swallowing it whole. This is typical of land mammals, but quite different from modern whales, which typically swallow their prey whole or in large chunks without chewing. Chemical analysis of the teeth provided another fascinating insight. By examining the ratios of oxygen isotopes incorporated into the tooth enamel as the animal grew, scientists could determine what kind of water Pakicetus drank. Different water sources, fresh water versus salt water, have different isotopic signatures, and these signatures get locked into growing teeth. The results were clear. Pakicetus drank fresh water. It lived in rivers, streams, perhaps estuaries, where fresh water and salt water mixed. But it was not yet a creature of the open ocean. Its tail was long and robust, though it lacked any flukes or specialized structures. The tail vertebrae were large and showed attachment points for substantial muscles. This suggests the tail was muscular and powerful, though exactly what role it played in locomotion is still debated. Some scientists think it may have been used for balance and steering while walking on river bottoms. Others suggest it may have provided some propulsion through side-to-side movements, similar to how crocodiles use their tails to swim. The body of Pakicetus was built for life on land, but with modifications that hint at an aquatic lifestyle. The limb bones were remarkably dense, much denser than you'd expect for a running animal. In fact, they were so dense that running would have put them at risk of breaking under the stress of impact and load-bearing. This density is called osteosclerosis, and it serves a specific purpose in aquatic animals. When an animal enters water, buoyancy becomes an issue. Fat and air in the lungs make mammals tend to float. For an animal that wants to stay submerged, that wants to walk along the bottom of a stream or shallow coastal water, this is a problem. Dense bones act as ballast, helping the animal stay down, maintain contact with the substrate, move in a stable, controlled way through the water. You see this same adaptation in modern hippos, which spend much of their time in rivers and can walk along river bottoms with surprising grace. Their bones are dense, their bodies massive, and gravity helps keep them grounded underwater. Pakicetus probably did something very similar. Instead of swimming in the water column, it likely walked along the bottom of shallow streams and coastal waters, using its weight to stay grounded as it hunted. The body of Pakicetus was built for life on land, but with modifications that hint at an aquatic lifestyle. The limb bones were remarkably dense, much denser than you'd expect for a running animal. In fact, they were so dense that running would have put them at risk of breaking. This density is called osteosclerosis, and it serves a specific purpose. When an animal enters water, dense bones act as ballast, helping it stay submerged and maintain stability. You see this same adaptation in modern hippos, which spend much of their time in rivers and walk along river bottoms. Pakicetus probably did something similar, walking along the bottom of shallow streams and coastal waters, using its weight to stay grounded as it hunted. The teeth tell us about diet. Pakicetus had a full complement of different tooth types: incisors for grabbing, canines for piercing, and molars for shearing. The molars showed signs of wear, with scrape marks indicating that Pakicetus ground its teeth as it chewed. Chemical analysis of these teeth, looking at oxygen isotopes, revealed something fascinating. The isotopes indicated that Pakicetus drank and lived in freshwater, not saltwater. It was a river dweller, hunting in streams and estuaries. But the real revolution, the adaptation that would define all of its descendants, was in the ear. Let's pause and really think about the physics of hearing, because understanding this helps us appreciate just how extraordinary the adaptations in Pakicetus were. When you're on land, sound travels through air as waves of pressure. These waves reach your outer ear, the pinna, that visible flap on the side of your head, that helps funnel sounds into the ear canal. The sound waves travel down the ear canal and hit your eardrum, a thin membrane stretched across the canal. The eardrum vibrates in response to these airborne sound waves, and this vibration is transmitted through a series of 3 tiny bones, the smallest bones in the body: the malleus or hammer, the incus or anvil, and the stapes or stirrup. These bones amplify the vibration and transmit it to the inner ear, where fluid-filled chambers contain hair cells that convert the mechanical vibrations into neural signals your brain interprets as sound. It's an elegant system, refined over hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution, and it works beautifully in air. But underwater, everything changes. Water is about 800 times denser than air. Sound travels faster through water, about 1,500 meters per second, compared to 340 meters per second in air. And here's the critical point. Sound travels through bone almost as easily as through water. When your head is underwater, sound waves don't just enter through your ear canals. They travel through your skull, through all the bones of your head, directly to the inner ear structures. Your eardrums, which work so well in air, are bypassed entirely. For a land mammal, this is a disaster for hearing. If you stick your head underwater and have someone make a sound, you'll notice it seems muffled and directionless. You can't tell where the sound is coming from. This is because the sound is entering your skull from all directions simultaneously. Your brain interprets the location of a sound by detecting tiny differences in when the sound reaches each ear, differences measured in milliseconds or even microseconds. If sound is hitting both ears at exactly the same time, because it's traveling through your skull, rather than through the water to your eardrums, you've lost that directional information. For an aquatic predator, this is a serious problem. Being able to detect and localize sounds is crucial for hunting, for avoiding predators, for social communication. Whales needed to solve this problem, and the first step in that solution appears in Pakicetus. The auditory bulla, that bony dome that houses the middle ear bones, underwent a dramatic transformation. It became greatly thickened, massively dense, a condition called Pakicetus. This wasn't just a slight increase. We're talking about bones that are several times thicker and denser than you'd find in a typical land mammal of similar size. This thickening had a specific function. It created a structure that could vibrate independently from the rest of the skull in response to underwater sound waves. Here's how it worked. Sound waves traveling through the water would hit the whale's head. These waves would propagate through the skull bones, setting them vibrating. But the thickened, auditory bulla, because of its density and mass, would vibrate at a slightly different frequency or phase than the surrounding skull bones. It became, in effect, a receiver specifically tuned to underwater sound. The bulla could pick up these vibrations and transmit them to the middle ear bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes, which in turn would transmit them to the inner ear. The inner ear contains the cochlea, a spiral structure filled with fluid and lined with thousands of hair cells, each tuned to specific frequencies. When the fluid in the cochlea moves, the hair cells bend, triggering neural signals that the brain interprets as sound. But Pakicetus had another innovation. The bulla was beginning to separate from the skull, not completely, but there were small air-filled spaces developing around it. These air spaces are critical for underwater hearing because air and water have very different acoustic properties. An air space creates a boundary where sound waves reflect or refract rather than passing straight through. This isolation helps prevent sound from traveling directly through the skull to the bulla, which would muddle the signal. Instead, sound has to reach the bulla through a more controlled pathway, allowing for better detection and potentially some degree of directional hearing. It wasn't a perfect system yet. Pakicetus probably couldn't echolocate like modern toothed whales, which have extraordinarily sophisticated hearing systems, and its directional hearing underwater was probably not nearly as good as what would evolve in later whales. But it was a start. It was good enough to give Pakicetus an advantage over other predators in its environment. It could hear prey fish moving underwater. It could detect the sounds of other animals approaching. It could begin to use sound as a sensory mode in its aquatic hunting grounds. To appreciate how important this was, consider what Pakicetus was competing with. The Eocene was home to many predators. Crocodiles, which had already mastered aquatic hunting and possessed their own sophisticated systems for detecting prey. Large predatory fish, potentially other semi-aquatic mammals. For Pakicetus to succeed in this crowded ecosystem, it needed every advantage it could get. Enhanced underwater hearing was one of those advantages. It opened up sensory channels that other mammals couldn't access. It allowed Pakicetus to hunt effectively, even in murky water where vision was limited. The ear anatomy of Pakicetus was so distinctive, so unlike anything in other mammals except later whales, that it became one of the key features paleontologists use to identify early whale fossils. Even from fragmentary skull material, if you can see the structure of the auditory bulla, you can often tell whether you're looking at a cetacean or some other mammal. It's a fossil fingerprint, a signature written in bone that says, "This animal belonged to the whale lineage." Imagine Pakicetus now, moving through its world. Let's paint the scene in detail, bringing this ancient environment to life. It's early morning along a river that flows into the Tethys Sea. The sun has just cleared the horizon, its golden light slanting through the humid air, creating a hazy glow. The temperature is already warm, and it will only get warmer as the day progresses. This is a tropical to subtropical climate, lush and verdant. The river here is perhaps 15 to 20 meters wide, flowing with a gentle current over a bed of sand and pebbles. The water is relatively clear, stained slightly brown with tannins from decaying vegetation, but clear enough to see several meters down in the shallows. Along the banks, dense vegetation thrives. Palms with fan-shaped fronds reach toward the sky. Ferns cluster in the shade. Flowering plants, relatively new arrivals in Earth's history, their lineage having exploded in diversity during the Cretaceous, add splashes of colour. Insects buzz among the reeds and flowers, and constant background drone. Somewhere in the trees, early primates might be calling to each other, though primate evolution is still in its early stages. Birds, descendants of dinosaurs, fill the air with song. Our Pakicetus emerges from dense vegetation along the riverbank. It moves carefully, deliberately, on 4 hoofed feet. Its movements on land are not particularly graceful. The dense bones that serve so well in water make terrestrial locomotion somewhat laboured. Each step requires effort, the weight of those heavy limb bones evident in the careful placement of feet, the slightly awkward gait. But Pakicetus is not concerned with running. It's concerned with the water. It pauses at the edge, where water laps against muddy bank. Its nostrils twitch, sampling the air for any hint of danger. Large predatory mammals roam these riverbanks, and Pakicetus must be cautious. Its ears, not yet adapted to be hidden blowholes, but still quite functional for hearing airborne sound, swivel and focus, picking up the subtle sounds of the environment. A breeze rustles the palm fronds. Insects buzz. Somewhere distant, perhaps a kilometre away, a crocodilian bellows, a low rumbling call announcing its territory. But here, now, there seems to be no immediate threat. Satisfied, Pakicetus steps into the shallows. The water is warm, perhaps 25 to 28 degrees Celsius, the typical temperature of tropical shallow rivers. As the water rises around its legs, there's an immediate change in the animal's demeanour. This is its domain. The body, which seemed slightly awkward on land, becomes purposeful in water. The water reaches its belly, then chest, and Pakicetus keeps walking, moving deeper, until the water is up to its shoulders. Instead of swimming, Pakicetus walks along the river bottom. Its dense bones keep it grounded, prevent it from floating. The feet, spread wide, find purchase on the sandy substrate. Each step kicks up small clouds of sediment. The tail, extending behind, sways gently, helping with balance. The eyes, positioned high on the skull, remain above the surface, even as much of the head is submerged. From the eyes down, the animal is underwater. From the eyes up, just the top of the head and ears are in air. It's the posture of an ambush predator, mostly hidden, watching, waiting. The river bottom here slopes gradually toward a deeper channel. Pakicetus makes its way along this slope, moving parallel to the current, conserving energy by not fighting the flow. The water is now at a depth where the substrate starts to show more interesting features. Rocks protrude here and there. A submerged log, fallen from the bank weeks or months ago, provides habitat for small fish and invertebrates. Aquatic plants grow in patches where the current is less strong, their long stems swaying in the gentle flow. A school of fish appears, moving upstream against the current. They're small, perhaps 10 to 15 centimeters long, silvery with dark stripes along their flanks. There might be dozens of them, swimming in loose formation. They're not spawning, not migrating, just moving between feeding areas, searching for insects or plant matter or smaller fish. They're part of the diverse fish fauna of the Eocene, distant relatives of modern freshwater fish, members of families that have since diversified or gone extinct. Pakicetus watches them approach. The eyes, though not as precisely forward-facing as a cat's, can still judge distances reasonably well. The fish are in open water, a meter or so above the bottom, moving parallel to Pakicetus's position, but offset by several meters. The animal makes a decision. It begins to move, not rushing, not alarming the fish, but positioning itself. It walks along the bottom until it's directly below the school's path, then stops, motionless, waiting. The fish continue their upstream journey unaware. They pass over Pakicetus, and now the predator strikes. With a powerful surge of its legs and tail, Pakicetus launches upward. The massive leg muscles contract, driving the feet against the substrate. The momentum carries the body up through the water column in a matter of a second. Jaws open wide. Those large canines are ready. The fish scatter in all directions, but Pakicetus has aimed for the center of the school, where escape routes are limited. Jaws snap shut with tremendous force. The thick teeth, designed for dealing with slippery prey, find purchase. A fish is caught. Pakicetus surfaces, lifting its head completely out of water to manipulate the prey. The fish struggles, but the grip is firm. With a toss of the head and a gulp, the fish is swallowed whole, passing down the throat. A successful hunt. The animal sinks back into the water, resuming its bottom walking stance, and continues its patrol. This is how it makes its living, hour by hour, day by day, walking the river bottoms, ambushing unwary fish, occasionally catching other prey that ventures into the water, perhaps turtles or smaller mammals that come to drink. But Pakicetus isn't just hunting in rivers. The fossils have been found in sediments that show evidence of varying conditions, from purely freshwater river channels to deposits showing brackish water influence, areas where rivers were meeting the sea. This suggests Pakicetus was adaptable, capable of moving between environments. In the estuaries, where fresh water mixed with salt water, the prey base would have been different. Mullet and other fish that could tolerate varying salinity levels, crustaceans, mollusks, a rich and diverse menu for an opportunistic predator. The daily life of Pakicetus would have revolved around the rhythms of its environment. Active hunting during the cooler hours of morning and evening perhaps, when prey fish were also most active. Resting during the heat of midday, perhaps hauling out onto a muddy bank, or lying in shallow water with just the top of the head exposed, cooling down, conserving energy, always alert for danger, for crocodilians that might see a small mammal as prey, for large terrestrial predators that might catch Pakicetus on land. And what about reproduction? We have no direct evidence of how Pakicetus gave birth, but based on what we know of aquatic and semi-aquatic mammals, we can make educated guesses. Like its terrestrial ancestors, Pakicetus probably still gave birth on land. The young would have been born after a gestation period of some months, perhaps 3 or 4, similar to modern mammals of comparable size. The mother would have sought out a secure location, perhaps a den among dense riverbank vegetation, or a concealed hollow. The newborns would have been relatively well developed at birth, capable of moving around within hours, though initially dependent on their mother for milk and protection. They would have stayed close to her, learning by observation and imitation, when to enter the water, how to walk on the bottom, how to hold their breath, how to spot prey, how to avoid becoming prey themselves. This learning period might have lasted weeks or months, the young gradually becoming more independent until they were ready to disperse and find their own territories along the river systems of the Eocene world. Pakicetus lived in a time of transition, not just for its own lineage, but for the planet. The Eocene was a period of remarkable biodiversity, of evolutionary experimentation. Mammals, freed from the dominance of dinosaurs by the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years earlier, were diversifying rapidly into niches that had never been occupied by mammals before. Flying mammals, the bats, were developing powered flight. Marine mammals, including early whales, were returning to the sea. Large terrestrial mammals were evolving, the ancestors of horses, rhinos, elephants. Primates were climbing into the trees and developing grasping hands and forward-facing eyes. Carnivores were diversifying into cats, dogs, bears, and other lineages. Pakicetus was part of this grand radiation, this explosion of mammalian diversity. It represented a lineage that had found a niche, that had discovered the advantages of aquatic hunting. And that was beginning the long transformation that would eventually produce the whales, dolphins, and porpoises of today. But it was only the beginning. Natural selection was working, generation after generation. Individuals with slightly longer tails, slightly larger feet, slightly better underwater hearing, slightly more streamlined bodies. These individuals had small advantages. They caught a bit more prey. They survived a bit better. They left a few more offspring. And over hundreds of thousands of years, over millions of years, the accumulation of these small changes would be profound. Within a few million years, Pakicetus's descendants would look noticeably different. Bodies would be larger. Limbs would begin to modify for more efficient swimming. Tails would become more powerful propulsive organs. The transformation was underway, slow by human standards, a blink of an eye in geological time, the steady march of evolution, reshaping a terrestrial mammal into something new, something unprecedented in mammalian history, a lineage committed to life in the water. And that next chapter would take the transition even further. About 48 to 47 million years ago, a new player appeared on the scene. An animal that could still walk on land, but had become even more committed to life in water. An animal with larger feet, shorter legs, and a more powerful tail. An animal whose name would come to define the transitional nature of whale evolution. The walking whale that swims. Ambulocetus. If you could step into a time machine and visit the coastal regions of what is now Pakistan during the Middle Eocene, about 48 million years ago, you might witness an extraordinary sight. There, in the shallow waters of an ancient estuary, where freshwater rivers met the Tethys Sea, you would see an animal that looked like nothing alive today. Picture a creature about 3 meters long, or roughly 10 feet, with the elongated snout and powerful jaws of a crocodile, but covered in fur. 4 limbs, each ending in webbed feet, the hind feet enormous and splayed wide. A long, muscular body, clearly designed for life in water, yet still capable of hauling itself onto land. This was Ambulocetus natans, the walking whale, and its discovery in 1992 would prove to be one of the most important finds in the history of paleontology. The story of Ambulocetus's discovery is itself a remarkable tale. In December of 1991, paleontologist Hans Thewissen was working with Pakistani colleague Mohammad Arif in the Kala Chitta hills of Punjab, Pakistan. They were surveying the upper portions of the Kuldana Formation, ancient sediments that once formed coastal deposits along the Tethys Sea. On January 3rd, 1992, Thewissen spotted something in the sediment, a femur, a thigh bone. It was clearly from a mammal, but its size and structure were unlike anything he had seen before. Further excavation revealed more bones, vertebrae, ribs, parts of the skull, limb bones. As the skeleton emerged from rock that had held it for millions of years, Thewissen realized what he had found. This was a whale, an early whale, but unlike any whale known before, this one had large, functional hind limbs. The skeleton was nearly complete, showing in exquisite detail what this transitional animal had looked like. When the formal description was published in 1994, Ambulocetus natans entered the scientific literature and transformed our understanding of whale evolution. The name itself tells the story. Ambulocetus comes from the Latin words for walking and whale. Natans means swimming. Here was an animal that could do both. Let's examine how. The skull of Ambulocetus was long and narrow, resembling a crocodile's in profile. The snout was lined with sharp, blade-like teeth, perfectly designed for catching fish and possibly ambushing other animals that came to the water's edge to drink. The jaws were powerful, with large spaces for the temporalis muscle, which closes the mouth. This animal had a bite to be reckoned with. The eyes were positioned high on the skull and partially faced upward, perfect for an animal that spent time submerged, watching for prey swimming above or approaching from the shore. Now, let's move to the body. The neck was long and flexible, much more so than in modern whales, allowing Ambulocetus to turn its head and strike at prey. The vertebral column shows clear adaptations for powerful undulation. If you watch a dog running, you'll notice that its spine flexes up and down, not side to side. Land mammals move this way because their ancestors did, because their limb and back musculature developed for this type of motion. Ambulocetus retained this pattern, but repurposed it for swimming. Instead of running across land with vertical undulations, Ambulocetus swam through water with vertical undulations. The forelimbs were shorter and more robust than in Pakicetus. The arms still had flexible wrists and 5-fingered hands with webbing between the digits, making them useful for swimming, but also still capable of supporting weight on land. The elbow joint was angled backward, allowing the forearm to push forcefully backward through the water for propulsion. The hands were large and paddle-like, but the real revolution was in the hind limbs. The legs of Ambulocetus were shorter than those of Pakicetus, but the feet were enormous. We're talking about feet that measured longer than the rest of the leg below the knee. These were not feet for walking. These were feet for swimming. Each foot had 5 splayed toes, likely connected by webbing, creating a massive paddle. The structure of the hip and upper leg bones shows clear adaptations for powerful retraction. The motion needed to pull the feet backward through the water in a swimming stroke. The tail was long and muscular, much more so than in Pakicetus. While Ambulocetus likely didn't yet have the horizontal flukes of modern whales, the tail was certainly an important part of its swimming apparatus, providing additional thrust and serving as a rudder for maneuvering. Scientists have spent considerable time analyzing how Ambulocetus would have moved through water. The consensus is that it swam much like a modern otter, using a combination of spinal undulation and powerful strokes of the hind feet. Imagine the animal swimming. The body flexes up and down, the spine bending in waves from head to tail. As the spine arches downward, the hind legs swing back and the massive feet push against the water, providing a powerful stroke. As the spine flexes upward, the legs are brought forward for the next stroke. The front limbs help with steering and stabilization. The tail helps with balance and adds to the overall undulating motion. This swimming style is called pelvic paddling or foot-powered swimming, and it's quite effective. Modern otters can reach impressive speeds using this method. For Ambulocetus, a predator weighing somewhere between 200 and 700 kilograms, depending on which estimates you trust, this style of swimming would have made it a formidable hunter. But what about life on land? Could Ambulocetus walk? The answer is yes, but not easily. The structure of the hip and hind limb bones suggests that on land, Ambulocetus moved more like a modern sea lion than like its terrestrial ancestors. Sea lions, when on land, rotate their hind flippers forward and use them along with their front flippers to waddle across beaches. Ambulocetus probably did something similar. The large feet would have pointed somewhat sideways or backward, making forward walking awkward. The animal would have needed to flex its spine side to side to swing the hips forward, dragging the feet along. It would have been clumsy, energy intensive, slow. This tells us something important. Ambulocetus still came onto land. It had to, or those limbs would have been useless and would have begun to disappear through evolutionary processes. Most likely, Ambulocetus came ashore to rest, to sun itself, perhaps to give birth and nurse its young in relative safety from aquatic predators. But increasingly, life was focused in the water. The environment where Ambulocetus lived supports this picture. The fossils were found in sediments that include both river deposits and marine deposits, with fossils of marine mollusks alongside leaf impressions from terrestrial plants. This was clearly an estuary, where fresh water met salt water, creating brackish conditions. Chemical analysis of Ambulocetus teeth, looking at oxygen isotopes, shows that this animal drank both fresh water and salt water, confirming it moved between different aquatic environments. It probably hunted along riverbanks, in estuaries, and in shallow coastal waters. What did it eat? The teeth suggest a diet of fish, certainly. But given its size and powerful jaws, Ambulocetus may have been an apex predator in its environment. Scientists have compared it to crocodiles in terms of lifestyle and hunting strategy. It may have lurked in shallow water, mostly submerged, watching for prey to approach. Then, with a powerful lunge, it would strike, using those massive jaws to grab and crush. Fish, certainly, but also possibly turtles, smaller mammals, any animal unfortunate enough to come within reach. Ambulocetus represents a critical stage in whale evolution. It shows us an animal that had committed more fully to aquatic life than Pakicetus, but hadn't yet abandoned land entirely. It pioneered the swimming style, the spinal undulation, and foot-powered propulsion that would lead eventually to the tail-powered swimming of modern whales. It was still very much a transitional form, caught between two worlds, but leaning increasingly toward the water. And evolution didn't stop there. Within a few million years, new forms would appear, even better adapted to life in the ocean. Forms that would venture into deeper water, that would spend even less time on land, that would begin to show the next crucial adaptations. Shorter hind limbs, longer tails, bodies increasingly streamlined for speed and efficiency in water. It's time to meet the next group of whale ancestors, the Protocetids, and among them, a creature with a crocodile's snout and a swimmer's body. It's time to meet Rodhocetus. As we move forward through the Eocene, advancing from 48 million years ago to about 47 million years ago, we come to a crucial chapter in whale evolution, the Protocetids. This family of early whales represents another major leap toward fully aquatic life. And among the Protocetids, one genus stands out as particularly important for understanding this transition. Rodhocetus, named after the Rodho geological formation in Pakistan where it was discovered, gives us perhaps our clearest picture of whales learning to live in deeper, open waters. Picture the environment first. The Tethys Sea has not disappeared, but the habitats we're exploring now are different from the rivers and shallow estuaries where Pakicetus and Ambulocetus lived. The Protocetids ventured further from shore into what's called the neritic zone, the region of the ocean that extends from the low tide mark out to the edge of the continental shelf. These are still relatively shallow waters by oceanic standards, perhaps up to 200 meters deep, but their marine environments fully salt water, and they're subject to waves, currents, and the full force of the sea. To live here required even greater aquatic adaptations. Rodhocetus was discovered in the 1990s, and specimens of two species, Rodhocetus casrani and Rodhocetus balochistanensis, have been found. These animals were roughly 2 to 3 meters long, about the size of a large sea lion. When you look at a skeleton of Rodhocetus, you can see immediately how much more aquatic this animal was compared to Ambulocetus. The body is more streamlined. The neck is shorter, reducing drag in the water. The tail is longer and more powerful. And crucially, the hind limbs are smaller, much smaller, though still present and apparently functional. Let's start with the skull. Rodhocetus had a long, narrow snout filled with teeth adapted for catching fish. The teeth were higher crowned than in earlier whales, better for gripping slippery prey. The eyes remained on the sides of the head, but were positioned well up on the skull. The nostrils, however, show an interesting change. In Pakicetus, the nostrils were at the very tip of the snout, just like in most land mammals. In Rodhocetus, the nostrils had begun to migrate backward, moving toward the top of the skull. They weren't yet positioned between the eyes like the blowhole of a modern whale, but they were getting there. This migration made breathing at the surface easier. Instead of needing to lift the entire head out of water to breathe, Rodhocetus could swim just below the surface and break only the top of its snout through, taking a breath while barely interrupting its forward motion. The auditory system had become even more specialized for underwater hearing. The ear bones show increased separation from the skull, a feature that helps with directional hearing underwater. The bulla was even thicker and more massive than in earlier whales. Rodhocetus was getting better at detecting sounds in its marine environment, essential for hunting and navigation. Now, let's look at the body. The vertebral column shows significant modifications. The cervical vertebrae, the bones of the neck, were shorter and less flexible than in Ambulocetus. A shorter, stiffer neck is typical of aquatic mammals. It reduces drag and prevents the head from being pushed around by water flow during swimming. The thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, the bones of the chest and lower back, were more numerous and showed adaptations for powerful vertical flexion. The muscles that ran along this part of the spine were clearly massive, designed to drive the undulating motion that powered swimming. The sacrum, the fused vertebrae that connect the spine to the pelvis in land mammals, was beginning to change in Rodhocetus. The connection wasn't as solid as in land mammals. The sacrum still had 4 vertebrae, partially fused, and there was still a connection to the pelvis through joints similar to those in land mammals, suggesting the animal could still support its weight on land. But this connection was weaker than in earlier whales, indicating that less time was spent on shore. The forelimbs had evolved into more efficient flippers. The hands retained 5 digits, and the fingers were splayed and likely webbed, but the overall structure was more paddle-like than hand-like. Interestingly, 3 of the central digits still ended in small hooves, a remnant of the ungulate heritage. The flippers were used primarily for steering and stabilization, not for propulsion. But here's where things get really interesting. The hind limbs. In Rodhocetus, the legs were definitely smaller than in Ambulocetus, and the feet, while still large, were not as massive. The structure of the leg bones and feet is fascinating. The foot had 4 toes, and while the toes ended in nails or small hooves, the shape and arrangement of the bones suggests something unexpected. The metatarsals, the long bones in the foot, and the phalanges, the toe bones, were extremely elongated and thin. They couldn't have supported weight on land, but they had another function. The shape of these bones indicates they could be tightly compressed together during one phase of the swimming stroke, and then spread wide during another phase, creating a variable area paddle. During the power stroke, the toes would spread wide, creating maximum surface area to push against the water. During the recovery stroke, they would compress together, creating minimum surface area to reduce drag. This is sophisticated swimming anatomy. But here's the question that has fascinated paleontologists. How did Rodhocetus actually swim? Based on the proportions of the body and limbs, and comparing them to modern mammals, scientists have concluded that Rodhocetus swam much like a modern desman, a semi-aquatic relative of moles. Desmans are foot-powered swimmers, using alternating beats of their hind limbs while undulating their body. So Rodhocetus was still using its feet for the main propulsion, but the balance was shifting. The tail was becoming more important, the undulation of the body more powerful, the feet relatively less dominant than in Ambulocetus. Imagine Rodhocetus now, swimming in the open waters of the Tethys Sea. The morning sun penetrates the clear blue-green water, creating shafts of light that dance and shift with the waves. Below, perhaps 10 or 15 meters down, Rodhocetus glides through the water column. Its body undulates rhythmically. The powerful back muscles contract and relax, bending the spine up and down in smooth waves. The hind feet beat in alternation, left foot, right foot, adding thrust with each stroke. The tail sways, adding to the motion. The front flippers are held close to the body for streamlined efficiency, extended only slightly for fine adjustments in direction. A school of fish catches Rodhocetus's attention. It angles downward, increasing the amplitude of its undulations, accelerating. The fish scatter, but Rodhocetus is surprisingly agile for an animal its size. It twists, using its flippers to bank sharply, and snaps its jaws shut on a fish. Successful, it continues swimming, swallowing its prey whole, already scanning for the next opportunity. After an hour of hunting, Rodhocetus surfaces. The nostrils, positioned well back on the snout, break the surface first, and the animal exhales forcefully, then inhales. It barely needs to slow down. A breath taken, it submerges again. This is an animal thoroughly adapted to life in the water, spending most of its time submerged, coming up only briefly to breathe. But Rodhocetus probably still returned to land on occasion. Those sacral connections to the pelvis, weak though they were becoming, still suggest some ability to support weight. Perhaps females came ashore to give birth, finding isolated beaches where they could bear and nurse their young in relative safety. Perhaps the animals came ashore to rest during storms, or to escape particularly large predators. But these excursions were becoming rarer. Life was in the water now. The Pakicetus, as a group, were diverse and successful. They spread across much of the Tethys Sea, with fossils found in Pakistan, India, Egypt, and even as far as Western Africa. Some species were small, just a couple of meters long. Others were larger, approaching the size of small modern whales. They occupied various ecological niches, hunting different prey in different parts of the ocean. And crucially, they were moving into deeper and deeper water, further and further from shore. This outward expansion, this movement into the open ocean, set the stage for the next great transformation. Because to truly succeed in the open sea, to become fully marine mammals, several more critical adaptations were needed. The hind limbs needed to shrink further or disappear entirely, as they created drag and were no longer useful for locomotion. The tail needed to develop horizontal flukes, the most efficient structure for propulsion in water. The body needed to become even more streamlined. Breathing needed to become even more efficient, with the nostrils fully relocated to the top of the head. Buoyancy control needed improvement. The ability to dive deep and stay down long needed to develop. And perhaps most importantly, the animals needed to be able to give birth in the water, severing the last tie to land. All of these changes were coming, and in the fossils from the late Eocene, around 41 to 34 million years ago, we see them appear. It's time to meet the Basilosaurids, the first fully aquatic whales. It's time to meet animals that could never return to land, that had committed irrevocably to life in the ocean. It's time to meet Basilosaurus and Dorudon. The late Eocene was a turning point in whale evolution. By 40 million years ago, whales had made the complete transition to fully aquatic life. They no longer came to shore. They gave birth in the water. They were true creatures of the ocean, and the fossils from this period show us in remarkable detail what these fully marine ancestors looked like. The group we call Basilosaurids included some of the strangest and most fascinating whales that ever lived, and none was stranger than Basilosaurus itself. The name Basilosaurus is actually a mistake. It means king lizard, and it was given in the 1800s when paleontologists first discovered the creature's remains and thought they were looking at a marine reptile. By the time they realized it was actually a mammal, a whale. The rules of scientific naming meant the name couldn't be changed. So the king lizard remained, even though it was neither a lizard nor a king, but a whale, and quite possibly the most peculiar whale to ever swim the ancient seas. Basilosaurus was enormous, at least 17 meters long, possibly longer, making it one of the largest predators of its time. But what made it truly bizarre was its body shape. Unlike modern whales, which have relatively compact bodies with proportionate vertebrae, Basilosaurus had an incredibly elongated, almost serpentine body. The vertebrae of the thoracic and lumbar regions, the chest and lower back, were stretched out, some of them 3 times as long as they were wide. The result was a whale that looked somewhat like an eel or sea serpent, with a long cylindrical body, a relatively small head, and a long tapering tail. Let's examine this animal in detail, starting with the head. The skull of Basilosaurus was about 1.5 meters long, with a long, narrow snout filled with different types of teeth. Unlike modern toothed whales, which have simplified all similar teeth, Basilosaurus had incisors for grabbing, canines for piercing, and molars for cutting. The molars were particularly impressive, with serrated edges like steak knives. This animal was clearly a predator, and a highly effective one. Analysis of fossilized stomach contents, preserved within the rib cages of some Basilosaurus specimens, has revealed bones of large fish and even bones of smaller whales. Basilosaurus was an apex predator, perhaps the top predator in the late Eocene seas, capable of taking down sizable prey. The nostrils had migrated further back on the skull than in any previous whale, positioned roughly midway between the tip of the snout and the top of the head. They still weren't quite in the position of a modern whale's blowhole, but they were getting close. This positioning made breathing while swimming much more efficient. The whale could cruise just below the surface and break through with minimal interruption to its forward motion. The ear structure had become highly specialized. The auditory bulla was fully separated from the skull, suspended in soft tissue, allowing it to vibrate independently in response to underwater sound waves. The bulla was extremely dense and thick, optimized for picking up vibrations. The middle ear bones were arranged in a way that allowed for excellent directional hearing underwater. However, Basilosaurus still lacked the structures needed for echolocation, the biological sonar that modern toothed whales use. It relied on its eyes and ears to find prey, not on sound bounces. Moving back along the body, we come to the extraordinary spine. Like mentioned, the vertebrae were stretched and elongated, giving the animal its unusual proportions. But this wasn't just an oddity. It served a function. Basilosaurus swam not by using flippers or feet, but by undulating its entire body in a wave-like motion, similar to how an eel swims. The long vertebrae and powerful muscles running along the spine allowed for large amplitude undulations that could propel the animal through the water. It was an unusual swimming style for a whale, more primitive in some ways than what would evolve in later whales, but effective nonetheless. The rib cage was robust, protecting the large lungs and other internal organs. The ribs themselves were interesting, showing signs of Pakicetus, increased bone density, particularly in their inner portions. This density helped with buoyancy control, counteracting the whale's tendency to float, allowing it to maintain depth without constantly fighting to stay submerged. The forelimbs had become true flippers. The arm bones were shortened and robust. The elbow could still flex, unlike in modern whales where the elbow is locked, but the degree of flexion was limited. The hands were elongated, with 5 digits bound together by tissue to form a flipper surface. These flippers were used for steering and stabilization, for making subtle adjustments in direction, while the body undulated. And then we come to the hind limbs. This is where things get really interesting. Basilosaurus still had hind legs. Let me repeat that for emphasis. This fully aquatic, ocean-going whale still possessed hind legs. But they were tiny. We're talking about legs less than 60 centimeters long on an animal that might be 17 meters or more in total length. The legs were complete, with all the bones present: the femur, the tibia and fibula, the ankles, the feet, even toes with tiny nails. But they were utterly useless for locomotion. They couldn't support weight. They couldn't provide thrust. They were too small to do anything meaningful. So, why were they still there? This is one of the great questions. Several hypotheses have been proposed. One is that they may have served some role during mating, perhaps as claspers, to help males hold on to females during copulation. Some modern snakes have similar vestigial legs that serve this purpose. Another hypothesis is that they simply hadn't disappeared yet. Evolution is a slow process. Once a structure loses its function, it can take millions of years for selection to reduce it to nothing. The hind limbs of Basilosaurus may have been in the process of vanishing, caught in the middle of a gradual reduction. What we do know is that the pelvis, the hip girdle, was no longer connected to the spine. In land mammals and in earlier whales like Pakicetus and even Rodhocetus, the pelvis is attached to the sacral vertebrae, providing a structural connection that allows the hind limbs to support weight. In Basilosaurus, that connection was gone. The pelvis and its associated tiny limbs simply floated in the musculature of the belly, serving no structural function. This tells us that Basilosaurus absolutely could not come onto land. It was permanently, irrevocably aquatic. The tail was long and powerful, tapering to a point. Evidence from the vertebrae suggests that Basilosaurus had small tail flukes, horizontal paddles at the end of the tail like modern whales, though probably not as large or well developed. The vertebrae at the tip of the tail show flattening and other features associated with fluke attachment. So, while the body undulation was the primary means of propulsion, the tail flukes would have added additional thrust, particularly during bursts of speed. Imagine Basilosaurus now, hunting in the warm, clear waters of the late Eocene. Let's set the scene properly. Immerse ourselves in that ancient ocean. We're 40 million years in the past, in what is now northern Egypt. But in the Eocene, this was not desert. This was the floor of a shallow tropical sea, an extension of the Tethys, with water depths ranging from perhaps 20 meters in the shallows to several hundred meters in the deeper channels offshore. The water is a crystalline blue-green, so clear that visibility extends for dozens of meters. The sun, high in a cloudless sky, sends shafts of light lancing down through the water, creating moving patterns on the sandy bottom far below. The temperature is bathwater warm, perhaps 25 to 28 degrees Celsius. These are perfect conditions for life, and life is abundant here. Schools of fish move through the water in coordinated masses, thousands of individuals acting as one, creating living clouds that shift and pulse with hypnotic rhythm. The fish are varied. Some are ancestors of modern species we would recognize. Others belong to families that have since gone extinct. Experiments inform that didn't survive the changing conditions of later epochs. There are rays gliding along the bottom, their wing-like fins rippling as they swim. Sharks patrol the open water, already ancient by Eocene standards, their lineage stretching back hundreds of millions of years. Perfected predators that have changed remarkably little because they are so well adapted to their role. Near the surface, where light and warmth are greatest, smaller whales hunt. A pod of Dorudon, perhaps 6 or 7 individuals, work cooperatively to herd fish into a tight ball, taking turns rushing through the condensed prey, jaws snapping. Their high-pitched calls to each other carry through the water, communication that coordinates their efforts. But deeper, moving with deliberate purpose through the mid-water zone, there is a larger presence. Basilosaurus, 17 meters of serpentine predator, the apex of the food chain here, the most formidable hunter in these Eocene seas. Let's follow this individual, watch it navigate its world, see how it makes its living in this ancient ocean. The Basilosaurus undulates, slowly, almost lazily, its long body moving in smooth waves from head to tail. The motion is fluid, economical. Unlike the powerful thrusting of modern whales, which use their tail flukes to generate sudden bursts of speed, Basilosaurus uses the entire length of its body. Each vertebra flexes relative to its neighbors, creating a sinusoidal wave that travels down the spine. It's like watching a ribbon flutter in the wind, but massive, powerful, inexorable. The front flippers are held close to the body most of the time, reducing drag, extended only slightly to make small corrections in direction or depth. The tiny hind limbs, vestigial remnants of a terrestrial past, trail behind, serving no obvious function in locomotion. The tail, ending in small flukes, adds a final snap to each undulation, contributing perhaps 20 to 30% of the total thrust. Basilosaurus is not hunting at the moment. It's patrolling, cruising through its territory, conserving energy with its slow, steady swimming speed of perhaps 3 to 4 kilometers per hour. At this pace, it can travel all day without exhausting itself, covering tens of kilometers, monitoring its domain for opportunities and threats. The eyes, positioned on the sides of that long, narrow skull, scan the environment constantly. Basilosaurus doesn't have the binocular vision of a modern predator like a cat, doesn't have that precise depth perception that comes from forward-facing eyes. But it has a wide field of view, can detect movement across nearly 300 degrees without turning its head. And in the ocean, where prey can approach from any direction, including from above or below, that wide field of view is valuable. The ears, those elaborately modified structures, optimized for underwater sound detection, pick up the acoustic landscape of the ocean, the clicks and calls of Dorudon in the distance, the low-frequency rumbles of passing schools of fish, the sounds their bodies make moving through water, the scraping sounds of bottom-dwelling creatures, crustaceans and mollusks moving across rock and sand, the higher-frequency sounds of smaller predators, other marine mammals or large fish making their kills. Basilosaurus processes all of this, building a mental map of its surroundings, knowing where things are even when they're not visible. A large school of fish appears in the distance, perhaps a kilometer away, a dark cloud against the blue. Basilosaurus changes course slightly, angling toward them. The undulations increase in amplitude slightly. The frequency picks up a bit, and speed increases to maybe 6 or 7 kilometers per hour. Still not a rush, still measured, but purposeful now. As the whale approaches, the fish become aware of the threat. The school begins to shift, individuals on the edge moving away, the whole mass trying to put distance between itself and the predator. But Basilosaurus is experienced. It doesn't try to chase the entire school. Instead, it looks for individuals that are slightly separated, slightly slower, slightly vulnerable. Perhaps a fish that's injured or sick. Perhaps one that's lagging behind because it fed too much and is less maneuverable. There, a fish, maybe half a meter long, perhaps 20 kilograms, moving with a slight wobble that suggests something isn't quite right. Maybe it's diseased. Maybe it was injured in an earlier encounter with another predator. Doesn't matter. Basilosaurus has identified a target. Now, the real pursuit begins. The body undulation increases dramatically in both amplitude and frequency. The long spine flexes with increasing power, each wave traveling faster down the body. The tail fluke snaps more forcefully at the end of each cycle. Speed increases, 10 kilometers per hour, 15. The massive body, so seemingly ungainly at rest, becomes a living torpedo in motion. The water flows past in a rush. The fish, sensing the danger intensifying, tries to accelerate, tries to reach the safety of the main school, but it's not quite fast enough, not quite healthy enough. Basilosaurus closes the distance in seconds. The long snout, lined with those serrated teeth, opens wide. There's no subtlety here, no precise bite targeting specific areas. It's a straightforward strike. Jaws close around the middle of the fish. The triangular molars with their serrated edges, like steak knives, do their work. They slice through scales, through muscle, through bone. The fish is severed nearly in half. The front portion is swallowed immediately, passing down the long throat. The rear portion, still twitching reflexively, is grabbed and swallowed in a second bite. The entire encounter, from decision to strike to completion, takes perhaps 30 seconds. Basilosaurus slows, resuming its cruising pace, the meal settling into its stomach. But this was a small meal, barely an appetizer for an animal of this size. To meet its metabolic needs, Basilosaurus would need to consume hundreds of kilograms of food per day, perhaps as much as 1,000 kilograms or more if it's particularly active, or if it's a female nursing young. The whale continues its patrol. Hours pass. The sun moves across the sky. Basilosaurus makes several more successful strikes on fish, adding to its calorie intake for the day. But then, late in the afternoon, something else catches its attention. A sound carried through the water from kilometers away. The distress calls of something large, another whale. Basilosaurus changes course, heading toward the sound. Its speed increases, the undulations becoming more powerful. This could be a significant opportunity. As it travels, the sounds become clearer, louder. There are calls from multiple individuals, and there are other sounds too. The sounds of thrashing, of bodies moving rapidly through water, of impacts. The scene that comes into view is dramatic. A group of Dorudon, 5 of them, are hunting cooperatively. But their target is not fish. It's another Dorudon. Perhaps a juvenile from another pod. Perhaps an individual weakened by disease or injury. Whatever the case, the 5 hunters have singled it out, separated it from any potential help, and are now attacking. They're ramming it, biting it, preventing it from surfacing to breathe. It's brutal, but it's nature. These Dorudon are taking advantage of an opportunity for a substantial meal. Meat that will provide far more calories than the effort required to kill and consume it. Basilosaurus, however, sees a different opportunity. These Dorudon, focused on their target, are themselves vulnerable, and Basilosaurus, larger and more powerful than any Dorudon, has learned that these smaller whales make excellent prey. They're abundant, they're the right size for substantial meals, and when they're distracted by their own hunting, they're not as alert to threats from above. The attack comes from below and behind. Basilosaurus, approaching from depth, angles upward. The undulations increase to maximum power. Speed builds, 20 kilometers per hour, maybe more. The long body is a living battering ram. The Dorudon, perhaps 4.5 meters long, and weighing perhaps a ton, doesn't see the threat until it's too late. The impact is massive. Basilosaurus hits the Dorudon from the side with the force of a small car. The smaller whale is knocked tumbling through the water, disoriented, possibly with broken ribs or internal injuries. Before it can recover, before the other Dorudon can react, Basilosaurus is on it. Those powerful jaws close around the mid-body of the stunned prey. The serrated molars penetrate deeply. There's a violent shake, a tearing motion, and the Dorudon is fatally wounded. The other Dorudon scatter, their own hunt forgotten, calls of alarm broadcasting their panic. They flee at top speed, and Basilosaurus doesn't pursue. It has what it needs. The wounded Dorudon makes weak attempts to escape, but it's futile. Within minutes, it's dead. And now, Basilosaurus faces the challenge of consuming a meal that weighs nearly a ton, far too large to swallow whole like a fish. The solution is straightforward if brutal. Using those serrated teeth, Basilosaurus tears chunks of flesh from the carcass. Each bite removes kilograms of meat, blubber, and tissue. The chunks are swallowed whole, requiring no chewing, passing down the throat into a stomach capable of handling large volumes. The feeding takes time, perhaps half an hour or more, but when it's done, Basilosaurus has consumed perhaps 300 kilograms of food, enough to fuel its massive body for days. This is the life of an apex predator. Basilosaurus had few, if any, rivals in its ecosystem. No other predator was large enough or powerful enough to threaten a healthy adult. Only the largest sharks might have attempted to prey on juveniles or sick individuals, and even that would have been risky. Basilosaurus sat at the top of the food web, shaping the entire ecosystem through its predation. Pressure. The populations of Dorudon and other prey species were controlled by Basilosaurus hunting. The behavior of these prey species was influenced by the need to avoid Basilosaurus. Even the distribution of species across the habitat was affected, as prey animals sought areas where Basilosaurus hunted less frequently. But Basilosaurus's life wasn't just hunting and eating. There were other imperatives. Social interactions, though we have little direct evidence of this. Did Basilosaurus live in groups, or was it solitary? Based on modern whale behavior, there's a range of possibilities. Some predatory whales today, like killer orcas, are highly social, living in tight-knit family groups that hunt cooperatively and share complex vocal traditions. Others, like adult male sperm whales, are largely solitary, coming together with others only for mating. Basilosaurus was probably somewhere in this spectrum, but where exactly, we can only speculate. And reproduction. Basilosaurus, like all mammals, had to reproduce. Males would have sought out females, perhaps tracking them by sound or scent, though the sense of smell was already greatly reduced in these fully aquatic animals. Mating would have occurred in the water, a challenging feat for animals of this size and shape. This is where those tiny vestigial hind limbs might have played a role, possibly serving as claspers to help the male maintain position during copulation, similar to how some modern snakes use their vestigial hind limbs. Or they might have served no function at all, merely remnants that hadn't yet disappeared. Females, after a gestation period of perhaps a year or more, would have given birth in the water. The calf, probably 3 to 4 meters long at birth, would have emerged tail first, a pattern now universal in whales, allowing the calf to remain connected to the mother's oxygen supply until the last possible moment. As the head emerged, the mother or other females in a group would have helped push the newborn to the surface for its first breath. The umbilical cord would have broken, and the calf would have been on its own, swimming on instinct, though remaining close to its mother and dependent on her rich milk for months or even years. These were the rhythms of Basilosaurus life: hunting, feeding, resting, socializing, reproducing. And for millions of years, this way of life was successful. Basilosaurus and its relatives spread across the globe, reaching the Americas, appearing in fossil deposits from the Gulf Coast of the United States, from South America, establishing populations in every warm ocean. They were the first whales to achieve truly cosmopolitan distribution, the first to prove that cetaceans could cross ocean basins, could adapt to different regional conditions, could compete successfully with other large marine predators wherever they went. Speaking of Dorudon, this genus deserves its own discussion because it represents another important step in whale evolution. Dorudon was a relative of Basilosaurus, living at the same time and in the same regions, but it was smaller and had a more conventional whale-like body plan. Dorudon was about 4.5 to 5 meters long, roughly the size of a modern dolphin or small whale. Its body was streamlined and fusiform, torpedo-shaped, much more like a modern whale than like the elongated Basilosaurus. The vertebrae were normal in their proportions, not stretched. And this tells us something important. It tells us that the weird body plan of Basilosaurus was an exception, not the rule. Most whales, even in the late Eocene, were evolving toward the compact, streamlined body shape that would characterize all later whales. Dorudon shared many features with Basilosaurus. The skull was similar in structure, long and narrow, with heterodont teeth. The differentiated incisors, canines, and molars. The molars had 2 roots and were triangular with serrated edges, perfect for cutting fish. The nostrils were positioned midway between snout and eyes. The ears were specialized for underwater hearing, with the dense, detached bulla. The forelimbs were flippers, and like Basilosaurus, Dorudon had vestigial hind limbs, tiny and non-functional, telling us that this animal also could never come ashore. But Dorudon's swimming style was different. With its more compact body and proportionate vertebrae, Dorudon probably swam more like a modern dolphin, using oscillations of the tail and flukes for propulsion rather than whole-body undulations. The tail vertebrae show clear signs of fluke attachment, with vertical flattening of the terminal vertebrae indicating the presence of horizontal flukes. Detailed studies of the vertebral structure suggest that Dorudon could generate speed through the frequency of its fluke beats, rather than just amplitude. This is a more energy-efficient swimming style than whole-body undulation, allowing for sustained cruising speeds. Dorudon was likely a specialized fish eater. Fossilized stomach contents have been found in some specimens, preserving bones of fish within the rib cage. the jaws were powerful enough to deal with prey of considerable size, and the serrated teeth could cut through flesh efficiently. Dorudon probably hunted in the water column, pursuing fish in the open water of the neritic zone. It may have hunted cooperatively in groups, as some modern toothed whales do, though we have no direct evidence of this. One fascinating detail about Dorudon is that some fossils show evidence of predation by Basilosaurus. Several Dorudon skulls have been found with large puncture marks and bite marks that match the tooth spacing and shape of Basilosaurus. These aren't healed wounds, they're injuries that occurred at or near the time of death. The teeth marks tell a story of predation, of Dorudon being hunted by the larger whale. It's a reminder that the ancient oceans, like modern ones, were places of beauty, but also of danger, where every animal, no matter how well adapted, was part of an intricate food web of predator and prey. The basilosaurids spread across the globe. Unlike earlier whales, which were restricted to the regions around the Tethys Sea, Basilosaurus and Dorudon have been found in deposits from Egypt, Pakistan, the southeastern United States, and other locations around the world. This wide distribution tells us these animals could cross open ocean, could handle different water temperatures and conditions, were truly cosmopolitan in their range. They had conquered the seas, but the basilosaurids would not last forever. By about 34 million years ago, at the boundary between the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, they disappeared from the fossil record. The reasons aren't entirely clear. Climate change may have played a role. The world was cooling, and ocean currents and food webs were shifting. Competition from new whale lineages may also have been a factor, because by the Oligocene, a new radiation of whales was underway. The Neocetes, the modern whales, were beginning to diversify. And this brings us to one of the most important events in whale evolution, the split between two great groups that would come to dominate the oceans in very different ways. Around 34 million years ago, something remarkable happened in whale evolution. The lineage split into two distinct groups, each of which would go on to evolve extraordinary adaptations and to fill different ecological roles in the world's oceans. These two groups are the mysticetes, or baleen whales, and the odontocetes, or toothed whales. Every living whale, dolphin and porpoise, belongs to one of these two groups. They share a common ancestor, but they diverged in profoundly different directions, developing different feeding strategies, different anatomies, different sensory systems. Tonight, we're going to explore this great divide and understand how these two types of whales came to be so different. Let's start with the toothed whales, the odontocetes, because in many ways they represent the continuation of the lineage we've been following. The early odontocetes retained teeth, as their ancestors had, but they refined and specialized those teeth for different prey and different hunting strategies. Unlike the basilosaurids, with their varied tooth types, odontocetes simplified their teeth into more or less similar peg-like or conical structures. These teeth were still excellent for catching fish and squid, but they were no longer designed for cutting or chewing. Instead, odontocetes swallowed their prey whole or in large pieces. But the real revolution in odontocetes was the development of echolocation, the ability to use sound to navigate and hunt. This ability, a form of biological sonar, gave toothed whales an enormous advantage and allowed them to diversify into an incredible array of forms. Today, there are about 73 species of odontocetes, ranging from tiny vaquitas barely over a meter, long to the massive sperm whale, the largest toothed predator to ever exist, reaching 20 meters in length and weighing up to 50 tons. Let's talk about how echolocation works, because it's one of the most sophisticated sensory systems in nature. Toothed whales produce sounds by moving air through structures in their nasal passages called phonic lips. These tissue folds vibrate as air passes through them, creating clicks. The clicks are focused and directed forward by a structure in the forehead called the melon. The melon is a lens made of fatty tissue, and its particular composition allows it to focus sound waves into a directional beam, much like a flashlight focuses light. The clicks travel out through the water, moving at about 1,500 meters per second. When the sound waves hit an object, whether it's a fish, a rock, the seafloor, another whale, they bounce back as echoes. Now here's where things get really interesting. The returning echoes don't enter through the ears on the side of the head. Instead, they're picked up by the lower jaw. The jaw is filled with specialized fatty tissue that transmits sound waves to the middle and inner ear structures. By receiving sounds through both sides of the jaw and processing the minute differences in timing and intensity between the two sides, the whale can determine exactly where the object is, how far away, how big, what shape, even what texture and material. It's a three-dimensional acoustic picture of the environment, and it works in total darkness, in murky water, at depths where no light penetrates. The evolution of echolocation required massive changes to the skull. The skull became asymmetrical, with the left and right sides developing differently to accommodate the sound production and reception apparatus. The nasal passages were completely rearranged. The bones around the ears changed to isolate the hearing system from the rest of the skull, preventing sound from entering through bone and allowing for precise directional detection. These changes happened gradually over millions of years. But by about 25 to 30 million years ago, in the early Oligocene, echolocation was well established in Odontocetes. The development of echolocation opened up new ecological niches. Odontocetes could hunt in deep water far below where light penetrates. They could hunt at night. They could detect prey buried in sediment on the seafloor. They could navigate through complex environments like river systems or around ice flows. This versatility led to an explosion of diversity. Today, Odontocetes include dolphins, porpoises, sperm whales, beaked whales, beluga whales, narwhals, and killer whales, each adapted to particular habitats and prey. Some are river specialists, living in fresh water. Some are deep sea specialists, diving to depths exceeding 2,000 meters to hunt squid in the abyss. Some are pack hunters, working cooperatively to take down large prey. Some are solitary, some are highly social with complex communication systems. The range of forms and lifestyles is staggering. Let's think about some specific examples. Dolphins, members of the family Delphinidae, are generally small, highly social, highly intelligent odontocetes that live in the open ocean or along coastlines. They hunt fish and squid using echolocation, often in coordinated groups. Their clicks can travel hundreds of meters, giving them a large detection range. They're fast swimmers, some species exceeding 50 kilometers per hour in bursts. Their relatively large brains, complex social behaviors, and sophisticated communication have made them subjects of extensive scientific study. Sperm whales, by contrast, are deep-sea specialists. They have the largest brains of any animal on Earth. Massive square heads filled with an organ called the spermaceti organ, once thought to contain sperm, but actually filled with a waxy substance that may play a role in sound production and buoyancy control. Sperm whales dive to extraordinary depths, routinely exceeding 1,000 meters and occasionally reaching over 2,000 meters to hunt giant squid and deep-sea fish. They can hold their breath for over an hour. Their clicks are the loudest biological sounds on Earth, powerful enough to stun or disorient prey. They live in complex social groups, with females and young forming long-term pods, while adult males are more solitary. Killer whales, or orcas, are the ocean's apex predators. They hunt everything from fish to seals to other whales, using sophisticated hunting strategies that vary by population and are passed down through generations as culture. They live in tight-knit family groups with complex vocal dialects. They're found in every ocean, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, from shallow coastal waters to the deep ocean. They're a testament to the versatility and success of the Odontoceta lineage. But now, let's turn to the other group, the mysticetes, because their story is completely different. Somewhere around 34 million years ago, a group of whales took a radically different path. They lost their teeth, and in place of teeth, they evolved a remarkable feeding structure called baleen. These are the baleen whales, the filter feeders, and they include the largest animals ever to exist. Baleen is one of the most extraordinary structures in nature. It consists of long, flexible plates that hang from the upper jaw in rows, running from front to back along each side of the mouth. The plates are made of keratin, the same protein that forms human fingernails and hair. Each plate is triangular, with the base attached to the jaw and the tip hanging down. The inner edge of each plate is frayed into a bristle-like fringe. In large baleen whales, these plates can be several meters long. The number of plates varies by species, but a typical baleen whale might have 300 to 400 plates on each side of its mouth. How does baleen work? The whale takes in enormous amounts of water, either by swimming forward with its mouth open or by actively gulping water in huge mouthfuls. Then, it closes its mouth and uses its massive tongue to push the water out through the baleen plates. The plates act as a sieve. The water passes through, but prey items, anything larger than the spacing of the baleen fringes, are trapped on the inside. The whale then swallows the captured food. Depending on the species and the density of the fringe, baleen can trap anything from tiny krill, just a few centimeters long, to small schooling fish. This feeding strategy is called filter feeding, and it allowed baleen whales to exploit food sources that toothed whales couldn't access efficiently. The oceans are full of small organisms. Krill, tiny shrimp-like crustaceans, form enormous swarms in polar and subpolar waters. Small fish like herring, caplin, and anchovies form dense schools. Copepods, tiny crustaceans barely larger than a grain of rice, are among the most abundant animals on Earth. For a predator that hunts individual prey, these small organisms aren't worth the energy. But for a filter feeder that can take in thousands or tens of thousands of them in a single mouthful, they represent an abundant, reliable food source. The evolution of baleen didn't happen overnight. Early mysticetes, from the Oligocene and early Miocene, still had teeth, but they also had the beginnings of baleen. Fossils show small baleen plates coexisting with functional teeth. These animals probably used both: teeth to grab larger prey and baleen to filter smaller prey. Over time, as baleen became more effective, teeth became less necessary, and they gradually disappeared. By the mid-Miocene, around 15 million years ago, all mysticetes were toothless, relying entirely on baleen. The adoption of filter feeding had profound effects on mysticetes' evolution. For one thing, it allowed these whales to become huge. When you're swallowing tiny prey in massive quantities, there's an advantage to being large, because you can take in more water and process more food with each mouthful. The energetic demands of a large body can be met if you have access to abundant, concentrated food sources like krill swarms. Over time, mysticetes got bigger and bigger. This trend accelerated in the past few million years. The blue whale, the largest mysticete and the largest animal ever to exist, reaches lengths of up to 30 meters and weights of over 150 tons. Blue whales are so large that their tongues alone weigh as much as an elephant. Their hearts are the size of a small car. A small child could crawl through their arteries. Why did mysticetes get so large only recently? The answer seems to lie in changes to ocean ecosystems. Starting around 4.5 million years ago, the Earth's climate cooled significantly, and large ice sheets formed in the northern hemisphere. This changed ocean currents and nutrient patterns. Nutrients that had once been spread throughout the ocean became concentrated in certain regions, particularly near the poles and along coastlines, in pulses tied to the seasons. When ice melted in spring and summer, nutrients were released. Upwelling currents brought nutrients from the deep. Phytoplankton bloomed. Krill and other small animals fed on the phytoplankton and exploded in population. These krill swarms were incredibly dense, sometimes stretching for kilometers, containing hundreds of thousands of tons of biomass. For a large baleen whale, these seasonal superabundances were perfect. A whale could migrate to these feeding grounds, spend months gorging on krill, building up enormous fat reserves, and then migrate to warmer waters to breed and give birth, living off those reserves. The larger the whale, the more fat it could store, the longer it could go without feeding, the greater distances it could travel between feeding and breeding grounds. Size became an advantage. Natural selection favored larger and larger individuals, and so the giants evolved. Today, there are 15 species of mysticetes divided into 4 families. The rorquals, which include blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales, and minke whales, have throat pleats that allow their mouths to expand enormously when gulp feeding on huge mouthfuls of water. The grey whales are bottom feeders, diving to the seafloor to filter small crustaceans from the sediment. The right whales, including the North Atlantic right whale, North Pacific right whale, and southern right whale, have very long, fine baleen and swim slowly through the water with their mouths open, continuously filtering zooplankton. And then there's the bowhead whale, an Arctic specialist with the longest baleen of any whale, which it uses to filter tiny prey from the icy waters. Baleen whales lack echolocation. They can produce sounds, some of them complex and beautiful, like the famous songs of humpback whales. But these sounds are for communication, not navigation. Mysticetes rely on their eyes and on their acoustic sense of their environment. They can hear low-frequency sounds over vast distances, allowing them to communicate with other whales hundreds of kilometers away. So, we have 2 great lineages of whales, taking very different approaches to life in the ocean, both extraordinarily successful. Toothed whales using biological sonar, to hunt individual prey, diversifying into dozens of species adapted to different niches. Baleen whales using filter feeding to exploit vast quantities of small prey, evolving into giants. Both groups descended from the same ancestors, those early Eocene whales we've met tonight. Both groups show the power of evolution to produce magnificent adaptations when populations are exposed to new environments and new opportunities. But we're not done with the story yet, because there's another dimension to whale evolution that we need to explore. We've talked about how bodies changed shape, how limbs became flippers, how tails developed flukes. But what about the internal changes? What about the physiological transformations that had to occur for mammals designed for life on land to thrive in the ocean? It's time to look at the incredible adaptations of whale body systems, the changes to breathing, thermoregulation, circulation, all the hidden transformations that made whales masters of the sea. One of the most obvious differences between living in air and living in water is temperature. Water conducts heat about 25 times faster than air. For a warm-blooded mammal trying to maintain a body temperature of around 37 degrees Celsius in water that might be near freezing, this is a serious problem. Heat loss to the environment would be rapid and potentially fatal. Land mammals deal with cold by growing thick fur. Fur works by trapping air, creating an insulating layer. But underwater, fur is useless. The pressure of water compresses the air out, eliminating the insulation. So whales needed a different solution. They evolved blubber. Blubber is a thick layer of fat, or adipose tissue, that lies beneath the skin, surrounding the entire body. It's not just ordinary fat. Blubber has a specific composition, with particular lipids that give it excellent insulating properties. It's also highly vascularized, meaning it's threaded with blood vessels, which, as we'll see, is important for temperature regulation. The thickness of blubber varies by species and by season, but in large whales, it can be 30 to 50 centimeters thick, sometimes more. Right whales and bowhead whales, which live in cold polar waters, can have blubber layers up to half a meter thick. Blubber works as an insulator by creating a barrier between the warm core of the body and the cold water outside. The lipids in blubber have low thermal conductivity, meaning they don't transfer heat readily. The thickness of the layer means heat has to travel a long distance to reach the surface, and by the time it does, much of it has been absorbed or retained. The outermost layer of the whale's skin actually cools to near the temperature of the surrounding water, which further reduces heat transfer through conduction. But here's something interesting. Blubber's thickness isn't actually the most important factor in its insulating ability. Studies have shown that the water and lipid content of the blubber matter more than its thickness. Blubber with high lipid content and low water content insulates better. Different species and different individuals within species have different blubber compositions, which affects how well they can regulate temperature. Now, blubber is excellent at keeping heat in, but this creates a problem. What happens when a whale is active, when muscles are working hard and generating lots of metabolic heat? The whale could overheat. In fact, studies suggest that large whales are actually over-insulated for their size. If they couldn't dump excess heat, they would cook themselves from the inside. So whales evolved mechanisms to bypass the blubber insulation when needed. Certain parts of the body lack blubber or have very thin blubber. These areas include the flippers, the dorsal fin, and the flukes. These are called thermal windows. The tissues here are thin and highly vascularized, filled with blood vessels. When a whale needs to shed heat, it can increase blood flow to these thermal windows. The warm blood from the core of the body flows close to the surface, and heat is transferred to the water. When the whale needs to conserve heat, it can reduce blood flow to these areas, keeping the warm blood in the core. This is controlled by a system of arteriovenous anastomoses, tiny bridges connecting arteries directly to veins, bypassing the capillary beds in the skin. When these bridges are open, blood flows from arteries directly to veins without going through the surface capillaries, so heat isn't lost. When the bridges close, blood is forced through the capillaries near the surface, releasing heat. It's an elegant system of thermostatic control. Whales also have a sophisticated system called counter-current heat exchange. This is found in the thermal windows and other areas. The arteries carrying warm blood from the heart to the extremities are surrounded by veins carrying cool blood back from the extremities to the heart. The vessels are very close together, and heat transfers across the vessel walls. Warm arterial blood heats up the cool venous blood, and cool venous blood cools down the warm arterial blood. By the time the arterial blood reaches the extremities, it's already been cooled, so less heat is lost to the environment. And by the time the venous blood returns to the heart, it's been warmed, so the heart isn't receiving a shock of cold blood. This system is found in many diving mammals and in birds, and it's critical for maintaining thermal balance. One fascinating place where countercurrent heat exchange occurs is in the mouth. Baleen whales spend enormous amounts of time with their mouths open while feeding. In cold water, an open mouth is a major route for heat loss, but the soft palate, the roof of the mouth, contains a countercurrent heat exchange system that reduces this loss, ensuring the brain and core body don't cool too much. Another major difference between land and water is breathing. On land, breathing is easy. Air is all around. But in water, a mammal has to come to the surface to breathe, and that takes energy and time away from other activities. So whales evolved to breathe as efficiently as possible. The nostrils migrated to the top of the head, forming a blowhole, so the whale can breathe while barely breaking the surface, without interrupting its swimming motion. In toothed whales, the two nostrils have fused into a single blowhole opening, though internally there are still two passages. In baleen whales, the nostrils remain separate, forming two blowhole openings. When a whale surfaces, it exhales forcefully, clearing the blowhole of any water. The exhalation is so powerful, it creates a visible spout, a mix of moist air, water vapor, and sometimes mucus that shoots several meters into the air. Each whale species has a distinctive blow, different in height, shape, and angle, which experienced observers can use to identify species from a distance. After exhaling, the whale inhales rapidly, filling its enormous lungs, and then submerges. The blowhole closes tightly, sealed by powerful muscles and specialized tissue, preventing any water from entering. Whales have much larger lungs relative to their body size than land mammals. A human's lungs are about 6% of body volume. A whale's lungs might be 10 to 15% of body volume. This allows them to take in more oxygen with each breath. But here's something surprising. When whales dive deep, they actually exhale first, collapsing their lungs. This seems counterintuitive, but it serves an important purpose. As a whale dives, water pressure increases dramatically. At depth, the pressure can be enormous. If the lungs were full of air, the pressure could force nitrogen from the air to dissolve into the blood. And when the whale surfaces, that nitrogen would come out of solution as bubbles, causing decompression sickness, or the bends. By exhaling before diving, whales reduce the amount of nitrogen in their system. They store oxygen in other places, primarily in their muscles and blood. Whale muscles contain high concentrations of a protein called myoglobin, which binds oxygen. Whale myoglobin levels are much higher than in land mammals, giving their muscles a very dark, almost black color. The blood also has high concentrations of hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in red blood cells. With oxygen stored in muscles and blood rather than in the lungs, whales can dive deep and stay down for extended periods without needing to breathe. The longest recorded dive for a Cuvier's beaked whale is nearly 4 hours, at depths exceeding 3,000 meters. During these dives, the whale's heart rate slows dramatically, reducing oxygen consumption. Blood flow is restricted to essential organs, the brain, heart, and key muscles, while other tissues are temporarily deprived. It's a finely tuned system that allows whales to access food sources far below the surface. Then, there are the sensory changes. We've already discussed how hearing adapted for underwater sound detection, how the ears became specialized for picking up vibrations through the skull and jaw, how toothed whales developed echolocation. But other senses changed too. Vision adapted for low light conditions, with large eyes and high concentrations of rod cells in the retina for detecting motion and shapes in dim light. Some whales lost color vision, as color is less important in the deep ocean where only blue light penetrates. The sense of smell, so important, for many land mammals, essentially disappeared. Baleen whales have very reduced olfactory structures. Toothed whales have none at all, having lost the olfactory bulbs in their brains entirely. In the ocean, chemical signals disperse quickly in the moving water, making scent less useful than it is in air. The sense of taste also diminished. Studies of whale genetics show that cetaceans have lost genes for detecting sweet, sour, bitter, and umami tastes. They essentially taste only salt. This makes sense for animals that swallow food whole, or in large chunks without chewing. There's no need to carefully evaluate flavor when you're gulp feeding on thousands of krill, or swallowing a fish in one bite. Reproduction also had to adapt for an aquatic existence. Land mammals typically give birth on solid ground, where newborns can breathe immediately. Whales had to figure out how to give birth in water. They did this by changing the timing and mechanics of birth. Whale calves are born tail first, unlike most mammals, which are born head first. This allows the calf's body to be delivered while the head and blowhole remain inside the mother until the last moment. As soon as the head emerges, the mother or other whales in the group help push the newborn to the surface for its first breath. The umbilical cord breaks and the calf is free. Whale calves are well developed at birth, able to swim immediately. They need to be because there's no safe place to rest. They have to keep up with their mothers from the first moments of life. Mother's milk is extremely rich in fat, sometimes 50% fat content compared to about 4% in human milk. This high-energy milk allows the calf to grow rapidly, building blubber and developing the strength and stamina needed for its aquatic life. Nursing happens underwater, with the mother's milk expelled forcefully from mammary glands and the calf latching on briefly to feed. All of these adaptations, the thermoregulation, the breathing, the diving, the sensory changes, the reproductive modifications, represent millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Each generation, individuals with slightly better adaptations survived a bit better, reproduced a bit more successfully. Over vast stretches of time, the accumulation of these small changes produced the magnificent creatures we see today. Whales are a testament to the power of evolution, to the ability of life to transform itself when environments change and new opportunities arise. And the story isn't over. Whales are still evolving. In the modern ocean, they face new pressures, from climate change to ocean pollution to noise from ships and industrial activities. How will they respond? Only time will tell. But the history we've explored tonight, from those first four-legged waders in the Eocene shallows to the giants that roam the oceans today, gives us some sense of the resilience and adaptability of these animals. They've been on an extraordinary journey, and in many ways, that journey continues. As we reach the end of tonight's exploration, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've discovered. We started 50 million years ago with a creature called Pakicetus, a wolf-sized mammal with hooves, walking on river bottoms, just beginning its aquatic journey. We met Ambulocetus, the walking whale, larger and more committed to water, but still capable of coming ashore. We encountered Rodhocetus and the Pakicetus, venturing into deeper seas, their hind limbs shrinking, their tails growing more powerful. We discovered Basilosaurus and Dorudon, fully marine, unable to return to land, their vestigial hind legs a reminder of their terrestrial past. We watched as the lineage split into toothed whales with their biological sonar and baleen whales with their filtering plates, each group taking a different path to success. We explored the incredible physiological adaptations that allow whales to thrive in the ocean, the blubber for insulation, the modified respiratory system, the enhanced oxygen storage, the sensory transformations. We've witnessed one of the most spectacular evolutionary transitions ever documented, a transition from land to sea that rivals anything else in the history of life on Earth. The evolution of whales shows us that change, even profound change, is possible when organisms are given time and when environments create opportunities. It shows us the power of natural selection to shape bodies, to fine-tune systems, to produce innovation after innovation. And it shows us that the past is not lost, that we can read the history of life in fossils, in bones, in the structures of living animals that still carry traces of their ancestral forms. Every whale swimming today carries within its body the evidence of this long journey. The tiny bones inside a whale's flippers are the same bones you have in your hands, the same bones that Pakicetus had in its front legs, modified but recognizable. The vestigial hip bones found inside whales, not connected to anything, floating in the muscle, are remnants of the pelvis that once supported hind legs. The horizontal tail flukes move up and down, not side to side, because whales evolved from land mammals whose spines flexed vertically. Every detail tells a story if we know how to read it. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine those ancient seas, the warm Tethys, the endless blue waters of the Eocene and Oligocene. Imagine the creatures moving through those waters, each one a link in the chain connecting past to present. Imagine the slow transformation, generation after generation, as legs became flippers and flukes emerged, and blowholes migrated and bodies streamlined. Imagine the first whale to be born at sea, the first to never touch land in its entire life. Imagine the wonder of it all, the majesty of evolutionary time, the patience of natural processes that can reshape entire forms of life. The story of whales is in many ways the story of evolution itself, grand and gradual, documented and demonstrable, accessible to anyone willing to look at the evidence. It reminds us that science is a way of knowing, a method for understanding the natural world through observation, hypothesis, and testing. And what we've learned about whale evolution is not speculation. It's supported by hundreds of fossils, by genetic data from modern species, by detailed anatomical studies, by isotopic analyses and comparative biology. It's as solid as any scientific understanding can be. Thank you for joining me on this journey through deep time. If you found this exploration calming and enlightening, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Bedtime Biology. Your support helps us continue creating content that blends science with serenity, that brings the wonders of the natural world to you in a format designed for relaxation and learning. Leave a comment below letting us know where you're checking in from and what aspect of whale evolution you found most fascinating. Perhaps you'd like to hear about other evolutionary transitions, the evolution of flight in birds, the development of complex eyes, the origin of flowering plants. Let us know what interests you. Until next time, sleep well, dream of ancient seas, and remember that you're part of this same grand story, this magnificent unfoldings of life on Earth. You carry within you the legacy of billions of years of evolution, the same basic cellular machinery, the same DNA, the same fundamental processes that connect you to every living thing, from the smallest bacterium to the largest whale. We're all relatives in the great family tree of life. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with wonder.